Last week, a farmer in North Dakota picked up the phone to book the rest of his fertilizer for spring planting. His supplier told him, "We're not pricing or delivering fertilizer right now. We're waiting to see how this shakes out." He hung up the phone not knowing if he'd have what he needed to grow his crops. That farmer feeds people. And the reason he can't get fertilizer has nothing to do with North Dakota, or farming, or anything most people would ever connect to their grocery bill. It has everything to do with a war and a chemical compound most people have never thought about in their lives. Here's something that sounds almost too strange to be true. Roughly half of every human being alive on Earth today, approximately 4 billion people, exists because of a synthetic chemical that was invented just over 100 years ago. The chemical is called urea. It's a nitrogen-rich compound. It's the world's most widely used fertilizer, and without it, the global food system as we know it simply does not function. Without synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, agricultural yields worldwide would collapse by somewhere between 30 and 50%, and the population of the Earth grew from roughly 2 billion people in 1900 to 8 billion today, largely because of synthetic fertilizer. Now here's where the story gets complicated. Urea is made primarily from natural gas. The process requires vast quantities of it, cheap and abundant. And as it happens, the part of the world with the cheapest and most abundant natural gas is the Persian Gulf. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Oman, the UAE. Which means the world's most critical food input is largely manufactured in one of the world's most politically volatile regions, and then shipped out through a single narrow waterway that apparently has a personal grudge against global stability. You can probably guess which one. When people talk about the Strait of Hormuz, they talk about oil, 20 million barrels a day, a quarter of global seaborne crude, the energy markets, and the inflation shock. We covered all of that in a previous video. But oil is only half the story, because the Strait of Hormuz is also responsible for approximately 49% of global urea exports, nearly 30% of global ammonia exports, and around a third of all seaborne fertilizer trade on Earth. In other words, the same choke point that controls global energy also controls global food production. And since late February, commercial shipping through the strait has effectively stopped. Not slowed down, stopped. At least 21 ships carrying nearly 1 million metric tons of fertilizer are physically stranded in the Gulf right now, unable to move. Qatar, one of the world's biggest urea producers, was forced to halt production at one of its largest plants entirely. Qatar's fertilizer exports alone were keeping roughly 43 million people fed across the United States, Brazil, and India. That supply has now dried up. And the timing of all this is particularly brutal because right now, mid-March, is the most critical window in the entire agricultural calendar for the Northern Hemisphere. Spring planting season, the moment when farmers apply fertilizer to their fields before crops go in the ground. Miss this window, and you don't get another chance until next year. Fertilizer that should be arriving at farms right now is sitting on ships that cannot move. The price impact has been immediate and severe. Urea prices at the New Orleans import hub, the main entry point for fertilizer into the American market, jumped from $516 per metric ton on February 27th to $683 on March 5th. That's a 32% increase in a single week. To put that in farmer terms, 1 ton of urea now costs American farmers the equivalent of 126 bushels of corn. In December, it costs 75. That gap, 51 extra bushels per ton, is the price of a war most Americans weren't paying close attention to. A farmer in North Dakota had already booked 60% of his fertilizer before the conflict began. When he went back to book the remaining 40%, the price had jumped $200 per ton, adding nearly $20,000 to his bill overnight. $20,000 for fertilizer alone, for one farm, in 1 week. The American Farm Bureau, the largest agricultural lobby in the United States, wrote an urgent letter to President Trump this month warning that, without intervention, the country risks a shortfall in crops that threatens both food security and a new wave of inflation. They were essentially asking the man who spent most of last year imposing tariffs on food imports to now save American farmers from a fertilizer crisis. You genuinely cannot make this stuff up. Here's where the story becomes truly global, because the fertilizer shock doesn't travel alone. It brings friends. The first domino is energy. Natural gas is the raw material for nitrogen fertilizer, so when gas prices spike, as they have by over 50% since the conflict began, fertilizer production costs spike everywhere, even in countries that make their own. The second domino is food commodities. When fertilizer gets expensive or unavailable, farmers use less of it or switch to crops that need less of it, and either way, yields fall on corn, wheat, rice, and soybeans, the four crops that underpin most of the world's food supply. The third domino is energy costs throughout the entire food chain, and this is the part most people miss. Energy isn't just an input at the farm level. It's an input at every single stage of getting food from the ground to your plate. Processing, packaging, cold storage, transportation, retail operations. A senior researcher at the International Food Policy Research Institute estimates that energy represents roughly half the total cost of your retail food bill. Half. Which means an energy shock doesn't just affect farmers, it compounds at every step of the supply chain until it arrives at the checkout. And there's a fourth domino that almost nobody is talking about yet: sulfur. Approximately 44% of the world's seaborne sulfur also transits the Strait of Hormuz, and sulfur is a critical raw material for manufacturing phosphate fertilizers. Since the conflict began, sulfur prices have doubled. This is what a supply chain crisis looks like from the inside. Not one thing breaking, but four things breaking simultaneously, each making the others worse. Not everyone absorbs this shock equally, and the gap between who can manage it and who can't is stark. In the United States and Europe, higher food prices are painful. They compound existing inflation and squeeze household budgets. But the food supply itself doesn't collapse. The story is completely different in the developing world. Brazil imports approximately 85% of its fertilizer and its soybean and maize production, which feeds not just Brazil but large parts of the global food system, is deeply dependent on Gulf supply. India is even more exposed, relying heavily on Gulf fertilizers for its monsoon planting season. And Indian fertilizer manufacturers have already cut urea output because LNG costs have made production too expensive. And in a particularly cruel twist, India's basmati rice exports to Iran, one of its largest markets, have halted entirely since the conflict began. India is losing supply and losing a customer at the same time. Then there's sub-Saharan Africa, where the situation is genuinely alarming. African nations have built their agricultural systems around imported fertilizers over decades, with no meaningful reserves and few alternative suppliers they can afford. A 30% spike in food prices in Germany is a political problem. The same spike in parts of East Africa is a hunger crisis. When this crisis began, there was one obvious candidate to step in and ease the shortage. China is the world's largest fertilizer producer, with enormous domestic capacity. In theory, redirecting Chinese exports to global markets could partially offset the loss of Gulf supply. It didn't happen. China responded to the global shortage by tightening its own fertilizer export controls, restricting outbound shipments, and reinforcing existing restrictions on urea exports to protect domestic food security. Which is entirely rational from China's perspective, but it does mean that the one country large enough to soften the global shock has chosen not to. Every other major alternative supplier, Canada, Russia, Eastern Europe, is either already operating at full capacity or comes with its own geopolitical complications. Which brings us to where we actually are as of this week. Nearly 1 million metric tons of fertilizer stuck in the Gulf, Qatar and Saudi producers declaring force majeure on shipments to South America and Asia, urea prices up 32% in a week, and farmers across the Northern Hemisphere making planting decisions right now without knowing what their input costs will be. A researcher at the World Economic Forum who studies fertilizer supply chains drew a direct comparison to the shock that followed Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, which itself caused a global food price crisis and contributed to hunger in dozens of countries. His assessment of the current situation? Honestly, I think it's worse. There's a longer story buried inside this crisis, and it's worth telling because this won't be the last time we're here. The reason so much fertilizer comes from one region is simple: cheap, abundant natural gas. Norway used to produce fertilizer using hydropower as far back as 1911. Then, in the 1980s, as Gulf gas made fertilizer production elsewhere uncompetitive, the Norwegian plant was partly converted into a museum. The world chose cheap over resilient, and here we are. India, Brazil, and Australia are now building serious long-term plans to produce what's being called green fertilizer, using renewable energy instead of natural gas. But these are 10-year projects. The planting season is now. The immediate question, the one that determines what happens to food prices over the next 6 to 12 months, is how long the Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed. Every week it stays closed is another week that farmers make decisions that reduce crop yields later in the year. The damage from this window doesn't show up at the supermarket immediately. It shows up in about 6 months, when harvests come in smaller than expected and the gap between supply and demand quietly pushes prices up in ways that are hard to trace back to their origin. So let's bring this back to where we started. A farmer in North Dakota couldn't get a price on fertilizer. A plant in Qatar went dark. A ship carrying 100,000 tons of urea is sitting anchored in the Gulf, going nowhere. None of that makes headlines the way oil prices do. None of it generates the same alarm as a stock market drop. But the chain it sets in motion, from fertilizer to crop yields to food costs, is arguably more consequential for more people than almost any other economic shock playing out right now. Half of humanity eats food grown with synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. We built the modern world on the assumption that those fertilizers would always be available, always affordable, and always move freely through a narrow strip of water in the Persian Gulf. That assumption is being tested right now. And the result? Higher food prices, tighter supplies, and in some parts of the world, genuine hunger will arrive not with a dramatic announcement, but slowly, quietly, over the next 6 months. By the time most people notice it at the supermarket, they'll have forgotten this moment entirely. But this is the moment.